It was late September when I decided to take a weekend trip to a remote cabin deep in the woods. I had been feeling drained from work, and the idea of isolating myself in nature for a few days sounded like the perfect way to reset. The cabin belonged to a friend's uncle, who rarely used it. He had given me directions, warned me about the lack of cell service, and told me to be careful of wildlife. I wasn't too worried. I had been on solo trips before, and I liked the quiet. The drive out there took longer than expected. The roads were winding and mostly gravel, cutting through dense patches of forest that seemed untouched. The further I went, the less familiar the world around me felt. There were no other cars, no houses, no signs of people at all. Just trees stretching endlessly on both sides. Eventually, the road turned into a narrow dirt path, barely wide enough for my car. The trees seemed even taller here, crowding in, their branches blocking out most of the sky. After another 15 minutes of driving, I finally reached the clearing where the cabin stood. It was small, nothing fancy, just a single-story wooden structure with a slanted metal roof. A wraparound porch faced the trees, and there was an old fire pit a few yards away. The place looked worn but sturdy, the kind of cabin built to last through harsh winters. I parked my car beside the cabin, grabbed my bags, and headed inside. The door creaked as I pushed it open, revealing a simple interior. A stone fireplace stood against one wall, and a small kitchen took up the corner opposite it. There was a couch, a wooden table with 2 chairs, and a single bedroom with a narrow bed. The air inside was stale, carrying the faint scent of wood and dust. I dropped my bag on the couch and walked around, opening the small windows to let in some fresh air. Once I had settled in, I stepped back outside to take in my surroundings. The trees were thick and close, their trunks dark and rough. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the clearing. It was completely silent, apart from the occasional rustling of leaves. No distant cars, no voices, no signs of civilization at all. Just me, the trees, and the empty sky. As the sun dipped lower, I started a fire in the pit outside. The flames flickered, casting an orange glow around the clearing. I cooked some food over the fire and ate, enjoying the quiet. The air had turned cool, and the sky was darkening into deep blue. After a while, I doused the fire and went back inside. I locked the door behind me, double-checked the windows, and got ready for bed. Lying in the small bed, I stared at the ceiling, listening to the distant sounds of the forest. The occasional creak of the wooden walls, the wind moving through the trees. It was peaceful. My eyelids grew heavy, and before I knew it, I was asleep. Sometime later, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. The room was completely dark, except for the faintest glow from the dying embers in the fireplace. I listened, my body still, trying to figure out what had pulled me from sleep. Then I heard it, a soft, shuffling sound outside. Slow, deliberate steps moving through the leaves. My breath caught in my throat. At first, I thought it might be an animal, a deer or a raccoon. But something about the sound was off. Too steady, too slow. I turned my head toward the window, but the darkness outside was thick. I couldn't see anything. The footsteps moved closer. They weren't heavy, but they weren't light either. I held my breath, listening. Leaves crunching, then silence. I waited. Seconds stretched. The air in the cabin felt heavy, like the walls were pressing in. I strained my ears, trying to pick up anything else. But the sound was gone. Nothing but the wind outside. Eventually, I convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe a stray animal passing through. Maybe the trees settling. I rolled onto my side, forcing my eyes shut, and willed myself back to sleep. The next morning, I stepped outside, squinting against the early sunlight. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth. I walked around the cabin, scanning the ground, half expecting to see footprints. But there was nothing unusual, just the normal scatter of leaves and twigs. I shook it off, deciding I was being paranoid. I spent most of the day hiking, exploring the area around the cabin. The woods were dense, the trails barely visible in some spots. It felt good to be moving, the steady rhythm of my footsteps keeping my mind from wandering. By the time I got back, the sun was dipping low again, I made another fire, cooked dinner, and sat outside for a while, watching the flames dance. The woods felt less unsettling in the daylight, but as the shadows stretched, I couldn't shake a vague feeling of unease. I went back inside earlier than the night before. I locked the door, checked the windows, then checked them again. The cabin felt smaller tonight, the walls closer. Lying in bed, I listened again. The wind moved through the trees, soft and constant. I told myself I wouldn't wake up this time, that I would sleep straight through until morning. But I did wake up. The sound was back. Footsteps, slow, deliberate. This time, they stopped right outside the cabin. I didn't move. My pulse pounded in my ears. The footsteps didn't retreat, didn't continue past. They just stopped. Then something brushed against the cabin wall. A soft scraping sound. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. The scrape came again, this time against the window. A light tap, then another. I stared at the ceiling, willing myself not to look, not to move. Then, from outside, the faintest sound. A whisper, a woman's whisper, too quiet to make out the words. But there, right outside the window, I lay frozen, my breath locked in my chest. The whispering stopped, but I could still feel it. Something standing there, just beyond the thin wall. Then, after what felt like forever, the footsteps started again, moving away, slow, steady, fading into the trees. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. At the first light of dawn, I packed my things, my hands shaking. I stepped outside, scanning the clearing. Nothing seemed disturbed. No footprints, no signs of anyone. But as I turned to leave, my eyes caught something on the side of the cabin. A single handprint, faint but there, just below my window. It was too small to be mine, and I knew, deep down, that no animal had left it. I got in my car, started the engine, and didn't look back. The entire drive home, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing at the tree line, watching me leave. I never told my friend's uncle what happened, never told anyone, but I never went back to that cabin, and I never will. I had been looking forward to the trip for weeks. A remote cabin, deep in the woods, away from the noise of the city. No work, no stress, just me and nature. I had rented the place online. A small, one-room log cabin deep in the mountains, advertised as the perfect getaway for solitude seekers. It was cheap, had decent reviews, and was far from any major roads or towns. That was exactly what I wanted. The drive took longer than expected. The last hour was on an unpaved forest road, full of deep potholes and loose gravel. My car wasn't built for this, and I had to take it slow to avoid bottoming out. The forest around me got denser the farther I drove, thick pines stretching high on both sides, blocking out the sky. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the road. I finally spotted the cabin, a small structure nestled between towering trees. There was no driveway, just a small clearing where I could park. The place looked exactly like the pictures. Aged wood, a covered porch with a single rocking chair, and a stone chimney sticking out of the side. The roof was dark with moisture, and the windows were small and old, framed by weathered shutters. The forest pressed in close from all sides, making the place feel even more isolated. I got out of the car and stretched, listening. It was quiet, too quiet. No birds, no wind through the trees, just absolute stillness. The kind of silence that feels unnatural. But I shook off the thought, grabbed my bag, and headed inside. The inside was basic but functional. A small wood-burning stove in the corner, a cot against the far wall, and a wooden table with 2 chairs. A single lantern sat on the table, next to a bundle of firewood. There was no electricity, no running water, just a hand pump outside for fresh water and an outhouse about 30 feet away. I had come prepared, bringing enough bottled water and food to last the weekend. I locked the door behind me, not because I felt unsafe, but out of habit. The first thing I did was start a fire in the stove. The cabin smelled damp, and the air was cold despite it being late summer. The fire crackled as it caught, and soon, warmth spread through the small space. After unpacking, I sat on the porch, listening to the woods. The quiet still felt heavy, but I forced myself to relax. I had been in the wilderness before. This was nothing new. The sun had dipped below the trees, and darkness crept in fast. I sat there for a while, staring into the woods, then decided to turn in early. Inside, I set up my sleeping bag on the cot and turned off my lantern. The fire cast flickering shadows across the cabin walls. The wind had picked up slightly, rustling the branches outside. I closed my eyes, listening to the distant creaks of trees swaying in the wind. I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, I was awake. Something had woken me. I lay still, heart pounding, listening. At first, I heard nothing but the fire's soft crackling. Then, a sound outside. Faint, shuffling noise. I held my breath. It wasn't the wind. It was too deliberate, too rhythmic, like footsteps. Slow, careful steps moving around the cabin. I stayed completely still, my ears straining. The steps stopped, then started again, circling the cabin. My mind raced through possibilities. An animal? A deer? A bear? But bears didn't move like this, and deer wouldn't come this close to a cabin with a fire inside. Then came a sound that made my stomach drop. The soft creak of a floorboard on the porch. Someone was outside. I barely breathed, staring at the door. My car was parked right in front, making it obvious someone was here. Why would anyone come out here in the middle of the night? The porch creaked again. Then silence. I stayed frozen, my eyes locked on the door. Minutes passed. Then, after what felt like an eternity, I heard slow footsteps retreating into the woods, fading, then gone. I didn't sleep after that. I sat up, gripping my flashlight, listening for any hint of movement. Nothing came. By the time the sky started to lighten, I convinced myself it had to be an animal. Maybe a coyote, maybe even a person, but if they left, it meant they weren't coming back. When daylight finally filled the cabin, I stepped outside. The forest was still, morning mist curling through the trees. I walked to the edge of the porch and looked down. Footprints, human footprints. They circled the cabin, stopping at the porch steps, then leading back into the woods. I followed them a few feet before they disappeared into the underbrush. The prints were deep, meaning whoever made them had some weight to them. I didn't see any shoe patterns, just rough impressions, like someone had been walking in socks or bare feet. A wave of unease rolled through me. This wasn't a lost hiker. This was someone sneaking around a cabin in the middle of the night, barefoot and watching. I forced myself to shake it off. Maybe it was just some local messing with me. Maybe some drifter who didn't realize the cabin was rented out. Either way, I wasn't sticking around another night. I packed my things quickly, making sure I left nothing behind. Before getting in my car, I took one last look at the cabin. The woods around it seemed darker now, the trees pressing in even closer. As I drove away, my tires kicking up gravel, I caught movement in my rearview mirror. Just a flash of something pale and unmoving, standing at the tree line, watching. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I just kept driving all the way down that winding dirt road until I hit pavement, until I was far away from that cabin, until the forest was nothing but a distant memory. I never reported it. What would I even say? No crime had been committed. No evidence other than footprints that would have faded by now. But I never went back. Never rented another cabin deep in the woods again. And to this day, whenever I find myself in a quiet place, surrounded by trees, I can't help but listen. Because I know out there someone else might be listening too. I was looking forward to the weekend alone at the cabin. It wasn't really mine, belonged to my uncle, but he let me use it whenever I wanted. It sat deep in the woods, about a 2-hour drive from town, surrounded by thick trees and overgrown trails that hadn't been walked in years. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and there wasn't much cell service. That was the whole appeal of it. No noise, no people, just quiet. I packed light, some food, a couple of beers, a book I had been meaning to finish. The drive out there was peaceful, mostly empty back roads, the kind where you rarely see another car. I kept the window cracked, breathing in the smell of damp earth and pine. The last stretch of road was rough, more of a dirt path than a road, full of potholes and loose gravel. My truck handled it fine, but I still took it slow. By the time I pulled up, the sun was already dipping below the trees, casting long shadows across the clearing. The cabin wasn't much, just a small, one-room structure with a loft, an old stone fireplace, and a front porch that creaked when you walked on it. It had been in the family for years, built by my great-grandfather. The wood was dark and weathered, the roof sagged slightly in one corner, but it was sturdy. The place had always felt safe. I carried my bag inside, set my food on the small wooden table near the window, and went back out to grab firewood from the pile along the side of the cabin. The air had a chill to it, colder than it should have been for that time of year. I stacked the wood inside next to the fireplace, then stepped back out onto the porch to take in the quiet. The woods stretched out in all directions, thick and dark. I had spent so many weekends up here growing up that I knew the trails by heart. There was a small lake about a mile north, a clearing with a fire pit my uncle had built further up the hill. The nearest road was a good 4 miles back. The silence was deep. No cars, no distant sounds of people, just the occasional rustling of leaves and the chirp of crickets. I had always liked that about this place, but something about it felt different that night. I couldn't put my finger on it at first, just a feeling, the kind that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up. I stood there for a minute, looking out at the tree line, watching the way the last bit of sunlight disappeared behind the branches. Then I shook it off, chalking it up to being alone after spending weeks around other people. I went inside, locked the door, and got a fire going. The crackling of the logs made the cabin feel warmer, more familiar. I made a quick dinner, ate in silence, then sat in the old armchair near the fireplace with my book. I read for a while, letting the sound of the fire and the occasional creak of the cabin settle my nerves. At some point, I must have dozed off, because I woke up to the sound of something outside, a rustling, not the wind, not the usual sounds of the forest. Something moving, something big. I sat up, listening. The fire had burned low, casting flickering shadows across the walls. I waited, holding my breath. For a few seconds, there was nothing, just silence. Then the sound again, slow, deliberate movement. It was coming from behind the cabin, near the tree line. I stood up, careful not to make any noise, and moved toward the window. The glass was old and slightly fogged, but I could see well enough. The moon was bright, casting a pale light over the clearing. I scanned the edge of the trees, looking for movement. First, I saw nothing. Then, just for a second, something shifted. A shape, barely visible against the dark trees. I couldn't tell what it was. It was low to the ground at first, moving strangely, like it was crawling. But then it stopped and I saw it rise up. Tall, too tall. My first thought was a bear, but the way it moved was all wrong. It was slow, deliberate, like it knew I was watching. The longer I stared, the clearer it became. Broad shoulders, a long, narrow head, eyes that caught the moonlight, reflecting back like an animal's. But it wasn't an animal. I stepped away from the window, heart hammering. I grabbed the rifle my uncle kept above the door, checking the chamber. Loaded. I stood there, gripping the gun, listening. The movement started again, circling the cabin now. I swallowed hard. It had seen me. For the next few minutes, I stayed completely still, barely breathing. The footsteps were slow, heavy. Whatever it was big. Then silence. I waited, ears straining. Nothing. I stepped back to the window, carefully peeking out. The clearing was empty, the tree line still. I let out a slow breath. Maybe it had left. I stayed up for hours, waiting, listening. Nothing else happened. No more footsteps, no more movement. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I dozed off in the chair, rifle across my lap. I woke up just after dawn, stiff and sore. The fire had gone out, the cabin cold. I stood, stretching, and moved to the window. Something had been outside. The ground near the tree line was disturbed, deep tracks in the soft earth. I swallowed, gripping the rifle tighter. The prints were massive. Not bear prints, not human, something else. I needed to leave. I packed my things quickly, barely stopping to eat. The whole time, I kept glancing at the tree line, half expecting to see those eyes watching me again. I locked up the cabin, loaded my truck, and got the hell out of there. I didn't look back. I told my uncle about it later. He listened, nodding slowly. Then he told me something that made my blood run cold. He had seen it too, years ago. Same place, same eyes. Neither of us ever went back. I never liked being alone in the woods at night. Something about the way the trees swallowed the light, the way the wind carried strange sounds, always unsettled me. But when my cousin offered me his cabin for a weekend, I convinced myself I was being paranoid. He had owned the place for years, used it for hunting trips, and never mentioned anything worse than bad weather. It was small, old but well kept, sitting deep in a valley at the end of a dirt road, miles from the nearest house. No phone service, no internet, just a radio for emergencies. Exactly what I thought I needed. A quiet place to clear my head, get away from the noise of the city. The drive was long, the last 30 minutes on a rutted road barely wide enough for my truck. The trees pressed in from both sides, thick pines and bare-branched oaks. Sunlight barely touched the ground through the canopy. By the time I reached the clearing where the cabin stood, the sky was turning pale with the first signs of evening. The air was colder than I expected for late summer, and I could smell damp earth and old wood as I stepped out of the truck. The cabin itself was small, one story, built from thick logs darkened with age. A simple front porch, a stone chimney, and a single window on the front, its glass catching the last bit of daylight. The place had been locked up for months, but my cousin had left the key hidden under a loose rock near the door. The inside smelled musty but not bad, just old. Wood walls, a stone fireplace, a cot, a small kitchen area, and a single light powered by a generator out back. Simple but enough for a weekend. After unloading my bag and lighting the kerosene lamp on the table, I went outside to look around before it got too dark. The trees loomed high, their branches barely moving in the still air. A narrow trail led away from the cabin, disappearing into the undergrowth. My cousin said it followed the creek a mile or so before cutting back toward the road. I figured I'd hike it in the morning, maybe fish if the water was deep enough. By the time I got back inside, the sky had turned dark. The air felt heavy, pressing in against the walls of the cabin. I locked the door, made a quick meal on the propane stove, and sat in the chair near the fireplace. No fire, just the glow of the lamp and the occasional hum of the generator outside. The silence stretched on, broken only by the sound of crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves. Then, somewhere in the distance, a branch snapped. I tensed, listening. It could have been anything. A deer, a raccoon, even just the wind. But the night was still. No wind, no movement. Then another sound, closer this time. A steady, deliberate crunching of leaves. Someone walking. I stood up, moving toward the window, careful to keep to the side so I wouldn't be visible. The lamp's glow barely reached outside, but I could make out the edge of the clearing. The trees stood tall and black against the night. I strained my ears, waiting. Nothing, just the sound of my own breathing. I told myself it was nothing, an animal, a trick of my imagination. But I locked the door again, checked the windows, and sat back down, keeping the lamp low. I wasn't going to let some stupid noise ruin my weekend. Sometime later, I must have dozed off because I woke up to something tapping against the window. Light, rhythmic. I sat up fast, heart pounding. The room was dark. Lamp burned out. The tapping stopped. Silence pressed in again, thick and suffocating. I reached for my flashlight, clicking it on. The beam cut through the darkness, landing on the window. The glass was fogged from the inside, but outside, nothing moved. I waited, breath held. My mind raced through possibilities, tree branch, animal, something in the wind. But the air was still. no wind. For a long time, I sat there, gripping the flashlight. The night stretched on. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I must have drifted back into an uneasy sleep. Sometime in the early morning hours, I woke again. This time, it wasn't a noise that startled me. It was a feeling, a heavy, suffocating sense that something was wrong. The air inside the cabin felt thick, unmoving. My skin was cold, but I was sweating. Then, from the other side of the cabin, near the back door, I heard it. A slow, deliberate creak of wood. Someone was on the porch. I didn't move. I barely breathed. My mind ran through every explanation, but none of them felt right. The footsteps shifted. Another creak. Then silence. I stayed like that for what felt like an eternity, waiting, watching the dim outline of the door, half expecting the handle to turn. But it never did. Eventually, the first light of dawn crept through the window. The moment I could see the trees outside, I moved. I grabbed my boots, my bag, and my knife, and I was out the door in minutes. Outside, the clearing was empty. No tracks near the window. No sign that anyone had been on the porch. But I knew what I heard. I didn't wait. I threw my bag in the truck, turned the key, and backed out onto the narrow road, my heart still pounding. The whole drive out, I kept checking the rearview mirror, expecting to see something, someone, but the road stayed empty. I didn't stop until I hit the highway, miles from the cabin. Only then did I let myself breathe, hands still shaking on the wheel. I never told my cousin the full story, just that I didn't sleep well, that I cut the trip short. He laughed, told me the woods could play tricks on your mind. Maybe he was right, but I never went back to that cabin, and I never will. It started with little things. I was renting a small cabin in the woods, about an hour outside the nearest town. It wasn't anything fancy, just a simple one-bedroom place with a wood stove, a sagging front porch, and a shed out back. I had taken a few months off work to get away from everything. City noise, people, stress. I wanted quiet, and that's what I got. First, the cabin sat in a clearing surrounded by thick trees, mostly pines and some older oaks. A gravel road led up to the place, cutting through the woods, winding and narrow, barely wide enough for my truck. There were no neighbors. The nearest house was about 5 miles away, some old guy who'd lived out here for decades. I'd only met him once when I moved in. Other than that, it was just me and the woods. The first thing I noticed was the smell. It was faint at first, like perfume. Sweet but sharp, almost chemical. I figured it was from something I'd brought with me. A soap, maybe, or something left behind by the last tenant. But it wasn't inside the cabin. It was outside. I smelled it near the porch first, then by the shed. A couple of days later, I caught a whiff of it out by the treeline. Always in different spots, but always the same scent. It wasn't unpleasant, just out of place. I told myself it was probably a plant or something I wasn't familiar with. Then I started noticing footprints. I'd walk out in the morning and see them in the dirt near the cabin. At first, I thought they were mine. The ground was soft, and I figured maybe I'd walked through at night and forgot. But then I saw them in places I hadn't been. By the back of the cabin, near the shed. They were small. Not child small, but smaller than my own. Like a woman's. Barefoot. The prints were deep, the toes pressing into the dirt like whoever made them had been standing there for a while. Watching, I told myself it was an animal. That was easier to believe. But I knew it wasn't. A week passed. The smell got stronger. I started seeing disturbances in the leaves at the edge of the trees, like something had been walking there, moving between the trunks. Every night, I made sure the cabin was locked. I kept the windows shut even though the air inside got stuffy. I checked outside with a flashlight before bed, scanning the trees, the gravel road, the porch. I never saw anything, until I did. It was late. I had been reading, sitting in the old recliner near the wood stove. The fire had burned down low, just glowing coals. I stretched, stood up, and turned toward the window. That's when I saw her. She was standing just outside the treeline, maybe 30 yards away. The The moon was bright enough that I could make out her shape, the way she stood. She wasn't moving, just standing there, watching. I couldn't see her face. I didn't move. My breath caught in my throat. My first instinct was to turn off the light, but I forced myself not to. I didn't want to look like I was reacting to her. I didn't want her to know I'd seen her. I turned slowly, as if I was just going to get a drink or stretch my legs. I moved away from the window, toward the shotgun I kept near the door. When I looked back, she was gone. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I went outside, shotgun in hand. I walked over to where she'd been standing. The ground was disturbed, the leaves pushed down where she'd been. I found footprints, barefoot, the toes dug in deep, like she'd been pressing down into the dirt. I followed them for a while. They led deeper into the woods, winding between trees, sometimes vanishing where the ground was rocky or covered in fallen branches. After about 100 yards, they disappeared completely. I spent the day chopping wood. I needed to keep myself busy. The whole time I felt watched. That night, I locked everything up tight, closed the shutters, kept the shotgun next to the bed. I forced myself to sleep, but it didn't last. A noise woke me up. It was soft, almost gentle. A rustling sound, like something brushing against the walls of the cabin. Then a creak from the porch. I reached for the shotgun. My hands were sweaty, and I had to grip it tight to stop them from shaking. Silence. Then, a slow, deliberate sound. The doorknob turning. I held my breath. The knob rattled once, twice. Stopped. I stayed completely still. The shotgun raised. My eyes locked on the door. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. Minutes passed. Nothing. Then, footsteps. Light, careful, moving around the side of the cabin. I turned toward the window, trying to see through the slats of the shutters. A shadow moved past. I didn't sleep. The next morning, I went outside, every muscle in my body tense. The smell was strong, sickly sweet. It was all around the cabin now, clinging to the wood, the dirt, my skin. I found something by the porch steps. A flower. A single wildflower, small and white, placed carefully on the top step. I didn't touch it. I didn't want to. I wanted to leave, but I didn't. I told myself she was just some woman from town, maybe living in the woods, maybe unstable. I told myself if I stayed alert, kept my gun close, I'd be fine. I was wrong. That night, I stayed up late again. The fire was burning low, and I was sitting in the recliner, just listening. Then something soft, a whisper. I didn't hear words, just breath, just the faintest sound of someone exhaling near the window. I turned my head slowly. The shutters were closed, but something moved outside. A shadow, then a tap, soft, careful, fingertips against the wood. I stood, shotgun raised. My throat was dry. Another tap, then silence. I stayed like that for hours, standing, waiting. Eventually, I moved to the bed, shotgun across my lap. I must have dozed off. When I woke up, it was dawn. I walked outside, stomach tight. I already knew what I'd find. More footprints, more flowers, this time arranged in a circle on the porch. The smell was overwhelming. I left that afternoon. I packed everything in my truck, barely locking the cabin behind me. I drove out fast, checking the rearview mirror every few seconds. I didn't see her. I never went back. I called the owner, told him something was wrong with the place, that I was leaving early. He didn't ask questions. For weeks after, I felt watched, even back in town, in the grocery store, at night in my apartment. Sometimes, I'd wake up and swear I smelled that perfume. It faded with time, but I never stopped looking over my shoulder. The cabin was small, but that was the whole point. I wanted to be away from everything. No city noise, no streetlights, no people knocking on my door. Just trees, wind, and quiet. The rental listing had described it as secluded, and that was exactly what I wanted. A one-room cabin with a wood stove, a tiny kitchen, a bathroom with just enough hot water to shower if I didn't waste any, and a narrow loft for sleeping. It sat on a small clearing, surrounded by trees that stretched high into the sky, branches swaying even when there wasn't much wind. The drive up had been long, over 2 hours from the last sign of civilization, mostly on winding dirt roads that seemed barely maintained. My tires had kicked up dust, and when I finally parked, I sat for a moment, listening. The forest was dense, thick with old trees and undergrowth. It was the kind of place where you wouldn't hear a car door slam from more than 100 yards away. That kind of isolation was exactly what I wanted. I unloaded my bags, locked my car, and carried everything inside. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and something faintly damp, like old leaves after a rain. The inside was simple, almost bare. A wooden table, a few chairs, shelves with mismatched plates and mugs. The bed in the loft was just a mattress on a wooden platform. It was enough, more than enough. I spent the first day settling in, unpacking food, making sure the firewood outside was dry enough to burn, checking the water pressure. The sun set early in the trees, and by the time I finished eating, the sky was dark. No street lights, no glow from a nearby town, just blackness, thick and heavy, pressing against the windows. I stood outside for a while, looking up at the stars, feeling the cold creep into my clothes. Then I locked the door and went inside. I had expected the quiet to feel peaceful. Instead, it felt too quiet. The kind of quiet that made your ears strain for something, anything. I told myself it was just because I wasn't used to it. At home, there was always some kind of noise, neighbors, traffic, the hum of appliances. Out here, there was nothing. Even the wind barely made a sound. That night, I slept lightly, waking up several times to the creaking of the cabin settling. Normal sounds, I told myself, just the wood shifting, just the forest outside. The next morning was cold. I got a fire going in the wood stove, made coffee, and ate breakfast on the porch, watching the sun climb between the trees. I spent most of the day hiking the trails around the cabin, taking my time, not rushing. The woods were beautiful, and despite the nagging unease from the night before, I felt more comfortable in the daylight. It wasn't until I was walking back in the late afternoon that I saw her. She was standing at the tree line, maybe 100 feet from the cabin. An old woman, her back slightly hunched, her clothes loose and layered, the fabric hanging off her like it didn't quite fit. She wasn't moving, just standing there, looking in my direction. I stopped. My first thought was that she might live nearby. Maybe she was just passing through. Maybe she was lost. But the longer I stood there, the stranger it felt. She didn't wave, didn't call out, just stood still, watching. I walked toward the cabin, trying to act like I hadn't noticed her. Maybe she was harmless, but something about her presence made my stomach feel tight. When I reached the porch, I glanced back. She was still there. I went inside, locked the door, and stood at the window watching. After what felt like forever, she finally moved. Not toward the cabin, not away, just sideways. She stepped behind a tree, slow and deliberate, and then she was gone. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still out there. I kept looking at the windows, expecting to see her face pressed against the glass. I checked the locks twice, even though I knew they were fine. I told myself she had just been passing through. Maybe she hadn't even seen me. Maybe she hadn't been watching. But the next morning, I found footprints. They weren't mine. They weren't anywhere near where I had walked. They were in the clearing around the cabin, circling. Some were fresh. Some had been there long enough for the edges to soften. I hadn't heard anything in the night, no footsteps, no movement. But she had been here. I told myself I was overreacting. She was just an old woman. Maybe she lived in a cabin deeper in the woods. Maybe she wandered the trails the same way I did. But that didn't explain the way she had stood there, motionless. That didn't explain the footprints that circled, over and over. I spent the day close to the cabin, checking my surroundings, listening more carefully. No sign of her, no movement in the trees. As the sun started to dip, I forced myself to relax. It was fine. I was fine. That night, I woke up to the sound of something tapping against the side of the cabin. A slow, deliberate sound, like someone dragging their fingers across the wood. I held my breath, listened. It stopped. Silence. Then, a creaking sound from the porch. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. My gun was downstairs. I hadn't thought I'd need it up here, but now I wished I had it within reach. I crept down the ladder from the loft, moving as quietly as I could. I grabbed the gun from my bag and stood in the dark, listening. A long pause, then the sound of footsteps, not leaving, not approaching, just shifting, moving slightly, the way someone might move if they were standing just outside, deciding what to do next. I didn't turn on the lights. I didn't want to give away that I was awake. I just stood there, gripping the gun, waiting. The sound stopped. Then, after an impossibly long silence, the soft sound of something pressing against the front door. Not knocking, not forcing, just pressing, holding, like someone was leaning against it, listening. I stayed still. The pressure against the door lingered for what felt like forever. Then, finally, it was gone. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When the sun came up, I stepped onto the porch, gun in hand. Nothing was there, but when I looked down, I saw them, footprints, closer than before, almost at the door. I packed my things fast. I didn't care if I had paid for a full week. I didn't care if it was nothing. I just knew I needed to leave. When I got to my car, I hesitated. I turned back one last time, scanning the tree line. And there she was, standing just beyond the trees, close enough now that I could see her face. No expression, no sign that she was surprised or upset that I was leaving. Just watching. I got in the car and drove. Fast. My tires skidding on the dirt road as I pulled away. I don't know who she was. I don't know what she wanted. But I know she wasn't just lost. She wasn't just passing through. She had been waiting, watching, circling. And I don't think she ever planned to leave. I don't know why I thought a weekend alone in a cabin would be a good idea. Maybe I just needed a break from everything. Work, people, the endless cycle of noise. The idea of isolation sounded peaceful at first. No emails, no calls, no one knocking on my door. Just me, the woods, and the sound of nothing. I found the cabin through an online listing. It was old but well kept, deep in the woods, miles from the nearest town. The owner described it as perfect for those looking to disconnect. That was exactly what I wanted. The pictures showed a simple wooden structure, a porch with a couple of chairs, and a wood-burning stove inside. No electricity, no running water, just a creek nearby for washing up. It seemed rustic but manageable. The drive out was long. The last stretch was nothing but dirt roads, winding through thick trees, no signs, no markers, just an occasional tire track to remind me someone else had been here before. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was starting to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows across the clearing. The place was smaller than I expected. One room, a tiny loft for sleeping, and a small outhouse a short walk away. I stepped out of the car and stretched, breathing in the cool, damp air. It smelled like pine and earth, the kind of clean scent you don't get in the city. I grabbed my bag and stepped onto the porch. The wood creaked under my weight. A few boards felt a little soft, like they'd been soaked through one too many times. Inside, the cabin was simple. A wooden table with 2 chairs, a small counter with an old-fashioned water pump, and a stone fireplace with a metal rack for cooking. The loft had a thin mattress on the floor, covered in a faded wool blanket. No signs of mice or bugs, which was a relief. I spent the first hour settling in, setting up the small lantern I brought, gathering some wood from the pile outside. There was an old hatchet on a stump near the porch, its handle worn smooth from use. I figured I'd split some kindling before it got too dark. The forest around the cabin was dense. The trees stood tall and close together, their branches tangled, forming a thick canopy. It was quiet, except for the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of a bird. No cars, no voices, just nature. By the time I had a fire going, the sky was dark. The woods at night felt different. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It was heavy. Every crack of a branch, every rustle in the underbrush made me pause. I told myself it was just animals, probably deer, maybe a raccoon. Nothing to worry about. I sat by the fire for a while, listening, watching the flames flicker. The trees beyond the clearing were just shadows, shifting slightly in the firelight. I tried to shake the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. It was just my mind playing tricks on me. When I finally went inside, I locked the door. The latch was just a simple metal hook, nothing that would stop someone determined to get in. I shook off the thought. There was no one out here. That was the whole point. The loft was cramped but warm. I lay there for a while, staring at the wooden beams above me, listening. The fire crackled softly downstairs. The wind picked up outside, rustling the trees. I pulled the blanket tighter around me. Somewhere in the distance, a branch snapped. A heavy sound, like something big moving through the trees. My stomach clenched. Probably just a deer. I forced myself to close my eyes. Sleep didn't come easy. Every little noise kept me on edge. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke to silence. The fire had burned low, casting faint orange light across the cabin. Then I heard it. A sound just outside the cabin. Not an animal. Not the wind. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. My breath caught in my throat. I lay still, listening. The steps crunched against the leaves just outside the porch. Someone was out there. I swallowed hard, my mind racing. Who the hell would be out here in the middle of nowhere? I thought about the hatchet outside, useless now. My car keys were on the table downstairs. The footsteps stopped, right outside the door. The cabin was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. I didn't move. I barely breathed. Then the door handle rattled. Not hard, not forceful, just enough to test if it was locked. I gripped the blanket, my body tense. The weak metal latch was the only thing keeping whoever it was from coming inside. For what felt like an eternity, nothing happened. Just silence. Then slow, shuffling steps moved away from the door, around the side of the cabin. I turned my head slightly, staring at the small window near the loft. My heart pounded. I waited, listening. The footsteps circled the cabin. Once, twice, slow, patient. Then they stopped. Minutes passed. I didn't move. Finally, after what felt like an hour, I heard footsteps again. This time, they faded into the woods. I stayed awake until dawn. When the first light broke through the trees, I forced myself to move. I climbed down from the loft, my legs stiff. The fire was nothing but embers. The cabin was exactly as I had left it, but the air felt different, heavier. I hesitated before unlocking the door. When I finally stepped outside, the morning air was crisp and cold. The clearing looked the same as before, except for one thing. Footprints. They circled the cabin, stopping at the door, the window, the back wall. Large, booted footprints pressed deep into the damp earth. I stared at them for a long time. Then I grabbed my keys and left. I didn't even pack. I just got in the car and drove, glancing in the rearview mirror every few seconds, half expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the trees. I never found out who it was. I never went back. I rented the cabin for a week, thinking it would be a quiet escape. It was a small, weathered structure, sitting on the edge of a thick forest with no other buildings nearby. The kind of place that looked perfect in pictures but felt different in person. The trees stretched endlessly in every direction, and the only road leading to it was a dirt path barely wide enough for my car. I had booked it online, drawn to the idea of being alone in nature, but as soon as I arrived, I felt a weight in the air, something I couldn't quite explain. The cabin itself was old but sturdy. A single room with a fireplace, a small kitchen, and a creaky wooden floor that groaned with every step. The bed was pushed against the far wall, and a narrow window overlooked the trees. There was a small back door that led to a clearing behind the cabin, where a rusted fire pit sat surrounded by logs. I had brought plenty of supplies, food, water, a flashlight, and a first aid kit. I wasn't worried about anything happening. It was just a week. The first night was uneventful. I lit a fire, made some canned soup, and sat outside for a while, listening to the night sounds. The forest was alive with movement. Crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl, rustling in the underbrush. Normal sounds. But then, somewhere deeper in the trees, I heard something heavier moving. Not a small animal. Something larger, stepping through the brush slowly, deliberately. I told myself it was a deer or a bear, but I stayed on edge, listening. After a few minutes, the sound faded, and I convinced myself it was nothing. The second day, I explored the area a bit. The forest behind the cabin was dense, with narrow trails winding through it. I followed one for a while, stepping over fallen branches and ducking under low-hanging limbs. The further I went, the quieter it got. At one point, I stopped and realized I couldn't hear anything. Not birds, not insects, nothing. Just silence. It was the kind of silence that made my skin prickle. I turned back. I didn't run, but I walked faster than before, feeling like something was just behind me, just out of sight. I reached the cabin and locked the door behind me, shaking off the feeling. That night, it happened again. The sound of something moving through the trees. This time, it came closer. I sat inside with the fire burning low, listening. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, like someone walking carefully through the underbrush. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped to the window, but the darkness outside swallowed everything. I couldn't see anything, but I could hear it. The steps stopped just beyond the tree line, and for the longest time, nothing happened. I stayed awake for hours, listening. Eventually, I must have dozed off, because I woke up with the fire out, the cabin cold, and the first light of dawn creeping through the trees. I stepped outside, expecting to see animal tracks, maybe broken branches. But there was nothing. No sign that anything had been there. The third day, I forced myself to go for another walk, hoping to shake the unease that had settled in my chest. I took a different path this time, leading uphill. The air was thick, humid, the smell of damp earth filling my lungs. The further I walked, the worse I felt. I told myself it was paranoia, that I was imagining things. But then I saw something. A footprint. It was deep, pressed into the mud near the trail. A boot print. Someone had been here. I wasn't alone. I turned back immediately, moving fast. My heart was pounding. I reached the cabin, locked the door, and sat on the bed, breathing hard. I tried to think logically. Maybe it was an old print from someone hiking weeks ago. Maybe it was from a park ranger. But I knew it wasn't. The edges were sharp, fresh. Someone had been out there walking the same trail I had. That night, I kept the fire burning, the flashlight beside me. I barely slept, jumping at every sound. The wind picked up around midnight, making the trees groan and sway. At some point, I heard it again. Footsteps closer than before. I held my breath, gripping the flashlight so hard my fingers ached. The steps stopped right outside the cabin. Then a soft sound. Tap. Fingertips against the window. I didn't move. Couldn't. My entire body was frozen. The tapping came again, slow, deliberate. Just one tap, then silence. Another, then nothing. I stayed like that for what felt like hours. Eventually, the first light of dawn crept through the trees, and I forced myself to move. I stepped to the window, my hands shaking. No footprints, no sign of anything. I told myself I had imagined it, that the wind had knocked a branch against the glass. But I knew that wasn't true. On the fourth day, I packed my things. I didn't care that I had paid for a full week. I was leaving. But when I got to my car, my stomach dropped. The tires were slashed. Both front tires, deep cuts through the rubber. I stood there for a long time, my pulse hammering in my ears. Someone had done this. Someone had been close enough to my cabin to do this while I slept. I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal. The nearest town was miles away, too far to walk before dark. I was stuck. I spent the entire day trying to fix the tires, but there was no salvaging them. I was going to have to stay another night. I checked every window, every door, making sure they were locked. I kept the fire burning high. At some point in the night, I heard it again. Footsteps, circling the cabin. Slow, steady. I gripped the flashlight, my breath coming in short gasps. The footsteps stopped at the back door. Then the handle moved. A slow, careful twist. It was locked. The person on the other side didn't leave right away. They stayed there, testing the handle, waiting. My entire body was rigid, my skin burning with adrenaline. I didn't move. Eventually, after what felt like an eternity, the footsteps moved away. I didn't sleep. I sat there, shaking, listening. The first light, I grabbed my bag and started walking. I didn't care if it took all day. I was getting out of there. The forest felt different in the daylight, but I still couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I walked for miles before I reached a road. An old pickup truck passed, and I waved it down. The driver, an older man, looked at me with concern. I told him I had car trouble. He gave me a ride back into town. I didn't tell him everything. When I returned with a tow truck, my cabin was exactly as I had left it. But there was something new. On the back door, just below the handle, were deep scratch marks. Long, thin gouges, as if someone had been dragging a knife along the wood. I never went back. I had been looking forward to this trip for weeks. A remote cabin deep in the woods, away from the constant noise of the city. Just me, a few supplies, and miles of wilderness. I had rented the place online from an old man who barely used it anymore, and from the photos it looked perfect. Secluded, rustic, exactly what I needed. The drive out there was long, nearly 4 hours from the nearest town. The last stretch a winding dirt road that cut through dense forest. My truck kicked up dust as I navigated the rough path. The trees towering on either side, their branches forming a tunnel of green. I finally spotted the cabin just as the sun was beginning to dip behind the treetops. It was smaller than I expected, but sturdy. Made of old, weathered logs with a steep roof and a stone chimney. There was a wraparound porch with a few wooden chairs, and a set of deer antlers mounted above the door. The place had a certain charm, but also a loneliness to it, as if it had been waiting a long time for someone to come back. I parked my truck near the front and killed the engine. The silence that followed was almost overwhelming. No distant hum of traffic, no voices, just the sound of the wind shifting through the trees and the occasional bird call. I grabbed my bags and walked up the steps, the wood creaking under my boots. The key was exactly where the owner had told me it would be, under the heavy flower pot by the door. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air was thick with the scent of pine and old wood. The interior was simple. A small kitchen with an old propane stove, a wooden table with 2 chairs, a couch that had seen better days, and a stone fireplace with a neatly stacked pile of wood beside it. There was a single bedroom with a narrow bed, the mattress slightly sunken in the middle, and a small bathroom with just a toilet and a metal sink. No electricity, no running water, just a hand pump outside for well water and a few oil lanterns. It was exactly what I had wanted. I spent the next hour unpacking, setting up my sleeping bag on the bed, and lighting one of the lanterns as the daylight faded. I made a simple dinner of canned beans and some jerky, eating by the lantern's glow while listening to the distant sounds of the forest. The isolation was refreshing, but as the night crept in, the silence became heavier. I stepped out onto the porch and leaned against the railing, staring out at the tree line. The moon was rising, casting long shadows across the clearing. I had always loved the woods, but standing there, completely alone, I felt small. I decided to turn in early. The bed was stiff, and every movement made the old wooden frame creak. I lay there in the darkness, listening. The sounds of the forest were different at night, more distant, more cautious. The occasional rustling in the underbrush, the hoot of an owl, the whisper of wind through the branches. It should have been peaceful. Instead, it felt like something was just beyond the reach of my hearing, something watching. I told myself I was overthinking it, that I wasn't used to this level of silence. Eventually, I drifted off to sleep. I woke suddenly in the middle of the night, heart pounding. At first, I wasn't sure why, but then I heard it. A soft, deliberate crunch of footsteps outside. Slow, measured. Someone was walking around the cabin. I held my breath, straining to listen. The footsteps moved around the porch, the boards creaking under the weight. I stayed as still as possible, my body tense. Then silence. Long, stretched out silence. I waited, counting the seconds in my head, but there was nothing. Just as I began to think I had imagined it, I heard it again. Closer this time. A soft, almost hesitant step just outside the bedroom window. I turned my head slowly, trying to see through the darkness. The window was small, just above the bed, and covered only by a thin curtain. I couldn't see anything outside, but I could feel it. Someone was standing there. I stayed still for what felt like forever, my breathing shallow. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the sound was gone. No more footsteps, no more creaking, just silence. I didn't move for the rest of the night. I barely even blinked, afraid that if I shifted, if I made the smallest noise, whoever or whatever was out there would know I was awake. When the first light of dawn crept through the trees, I finally forced myself to move. My muscles ached from staying so tense, my skin cold with sweat. I got up slowly and went to the front door. I hesitated, then cracked it open just enough to look outside. The clearing was empty. The porch was just as I had left it. No footprints, no signs of disturbance. For a moment, I wondered if I had dreamed it, if my mind had played tricks on me in the stillness of the night. But when I stepped outside, I saw them. In the dirt near the cabin, clear as day, were footprints. Bare footprints. They circled the cabin, stopping at each window, each door. They weren't mine. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I had locked the door before going to bed. Whoever had been out here hadn't tried to break in. They had just walked around, watching. I felt exposed, standing there in the morning light, as if the woods themselves had eyes. I quickly packed my things, my movements sharp and hurried. I had planned to stay for a few more days, but I wasn't going to spend another night in that cabin. As I loaded my bags into the truck, I glanced back at the tree line. For a moment, I thought I saw something, a figure, just at the edge of the forest, standing perfectly still. But when I blinked, it was gone. I didn't waste any more time. I got in the truck, started the engine, and drove. The dirt road seemed longer than before, the trees pressing in on either side. I didn't feel safe until I reached the highway, until the cabin was miles behind me. I never told the owner what happened. I never left a review. I didn't want to know if someone else had experienced the same thing. I just knew I wouldn't be going back. The cabin was supposed to be empty, but I wasn't alone. I got the cabin for cheap. That should have been the first red flag. It was one of those places listed online with a bunch of grainy photos, just good enough to show it had 4 walls and a roof but not much else. The owner's description was vague. Secluded retreat in the woods, perfect for solitude. That was exactly what I was looking for. A week away from everything. No city noise, no responsibilities, just me and the trees. The drive up took longer than I expected. The last stretch was a winding dirt road, barely wide enough for my car. It felt like I was being swallowed up by the forest, the trees getting denser, their branches reaching over the road like fingers. I had to slow down to avoid potholes, the gravel crunching under my tires the only sound for miles. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was already starting to dip behind the treetops. It was smaller than I thought. A simple wooden structure, 1 story, with a slanted roof that looked like it had seen better days. The porch sagged a little, and the windows were covered in grime. But it was standing, and that was enough. I killed the engine and stepped out, stretching my legs. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. It was quiet, too quiet. I grabbed my bag from the trunk and made my way to the door. The key was in a little lockbox under the porch, just like the owner had told me. It took me a second to punch in the code with my numb fingers, but the lock clicked open. The door stuck for a moment before groaning on its hinges. Inside, it was exactly what I expected, dusty, dim, and basic. A small kitchenette, a couch with a moth-eaten blanket draped over the back, and a single bed pushed against the far wall. There was a fireplace, but it looked like it hadn't been used in years. I tossed my bag on the couch and checked my phone. No service. Not surprising. The owner had warned me about that too. There was a landline mounted on the wall near the door, an old beige thing with a tangled cord. I picked up the receiver, listened for a dial tone. It was faint, but it was there. At least I wouldn't be completely cut off. I spent the next hour settling in. Opened the cupboards, mostly empty, except for some old canned goods and a bag of sugar hardened into a brick. Checked the bathroom, tiny, with a rust-stained sink and a shower head that looked barely functional. The water pressure was weak, but it worked. I set up my sleeping bag on the bed, not trusting the mattress, and built a small fire in the fireplace to chase away the evening chill. As the sky darkened outside, the woods became a black void beyond the windows. I had no curtains to close, just bare glass reflecting the dim light inside. I didn't like that. Felt like the forest was watching me. But I pushed the thought away, pulled a chair up to the fire, and cracked open a beer. The sound came just as I was starting to relax. A sharp crack outside, like a branch snapping underfoot. I sat up, heart thudding. Listened. Nothing. Probably just an animal. The woods were full of them. I told myself that, but I still got up, moving quietly to the window. I pressed my face to the glass, trying to see past my own reflection. Nothing but darkness. I shook it off, went back to my seat, and forced myself to unwind. I must have dozed off at some point because the next thing I knew, the fire had burned low, casting long shadows across the room. The temperature had dropped. The embers crackled softly, the only sound in the silence. Then I heard it again. Not a branch this time. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, just outside the cabin. My stomach tightened. I held my breath, straining to hear more. The footsteps stopped. Silence stretched out, thick and suffocating. I reached for my phone instinctively, even though I knew there was no signal. My fingers tightened around it anyway, useless as it was. Another sound. Closer this time. A faint scratching against the door. Not knocking. Scratching. I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry. My eyes flicked to the landline. I didn't want to make a sound, but my legs moved on their own, carrying me toward it. I lifted the receiver, pressing it to my ear. The dial tone was gone. Just silence. The scratching at the door stopped. Then, a slow, deliberate knock. 3 times. I stood there, frozen. The knock wasn't forceful. It wasn't impatient. It was testing. I moved carefully toward the door, heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I didn't speak, didn't call out, just stood there listening. Nothing. I edged toward the window, staying low, and peered out. The porch was empty. The dim glow from the dying fire barely reached past the door, but I could just make out the ground below. Nothing. No footprints. No movement. Then I saw it. A shadow, long and thin, stretching across the porch from just beyond the glow of the firelight. Someone was standing just out of sight. I backed away from the window, barely breathing. Then another sound. Not from the door this time. From the window. A sharp, high-pitched squeal, like metal on glass. I turned just in time to see the tip of something thin and jagged dragging across the window pane. A shard of glass, scraping, pressing against the surface. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the chair. My hand shot out, grabbing the closest thing I could use as a weapon. A fireplace poker, cold and solid in my grip. The scraping stopped. Silence. Then, in a slow, deliberate motion, the shard of glass tapped once against the window. I moved fast, ran to the landline, hoping maybe, just maybe, the connection had come back. Nothing. I slammed the receiver down, breath coming in short, panicked bursts. The sound of footsteps again, moving away this time. Slow, measured steps disappearing into the woods. I waited. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Nothing. Finally, I forced myself to move. Grabbed my car keys, keeping the poker in my hand as I made my way to the door. I hesitated, listening. Still nothing. I yanked the door open and stepped onto the porch. Cold air hit me like a slap. The forest was silent. I ran to my car, threw open the door, and locked it behind me. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with my phone, trying to call 911. Still no service. I turned the key in the ignition. The engine sputtered, then roared to life. Headlights flooded the clearing. Nothing but trees and shadows. I wasn't going to wait around. I put the car in reverse, tires kicking up dirt as I sped backward onto the narrow road. My eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, scanning the darkness. Still nothing. I didn't stop driving until I hit the main road, miles away. My phone finally buzzed with service. I pulled over, hands still gripping the wheel too tight, and dialed 911. The dispatcher's voice came through. Calm, steady. I told them everything. The cabin's location, what I'd seen, what had happened. By the time officers arrived, the place was empty. No signs of forced entry. No footprints. Nothing. Just a single thin shard of glass, lying on the porch, glinting in the morning light. When I had nowhere else to go, my parents let me stay in their old cabin. It wasn't much, just a one-room structure deep in the woods, a place they'd bought years ago but barely used. It was meant for weekend hunting trips, but over time, those trips got less and less frequent. By the time I moved in, the cabin was more or less abandoned. It wasn't in terrible shape, but it wasn't great either. The walls were solid, and the roof didn't leak, but everything else showed its age. The windows had a thin layer of grime, and the wooden floor was uneven, creaking loudly when I walked. The wood stove was rusted but still worked, though it smoked if I didn't open the damper just right. There was no plumbing, no electricity, and the only water source was an old pump about 30 yards away that I had to prime every time I used it. The cabin sat in the middle of a thick forest, far from any main roads. The nearest neighbor was about 2 miles away, though I had never met them. A narrow dirt path led from the main road to the cabin, barely wide enough for my car. Every time I drove in, branches scraped against the sides like fingers dragging across metal. The forest felt dense, heavy, almost like it was pressing in. I had no other options. I was broke, jobless, and had nowhere else to go. My parents weren't thrilled about letting me stay there, but they didn't say no either. I took it as a silent agreement. I could be there, but I was on my own. The first few nights were cold. It was late autumn, and the temperature dropped fast as soon as the sun went down. I had a sleeping bag, some blankets, and an old cot that sagged in the middle. The wood stove helped, but it was a pain to keep going through the night. If I let it die down too much, I'd wake up freezing, my breath visible in the air. It didn't take long to settle into a routine. Mornings started with a fire to warm up, then a trip outside to pump water. Breakfast was whatever I had, mostly canned food and cheap bread. During the day, I looked for work, using the last of my gas to drive into town. Evenings were spent chopping wood, reading, or just sitting by the fire. Nights were the hardest. The first time I felt something was off, it was just a small thing. A noise. I had been asleep when I heard it. Something moving outside. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer. I listened, waiting for it to move on. But it didn't. The sound was slow, deliberate. Leaves crunching under careful steps. Not the random scuffling of an animal, but something that moved with purpose. I sat up, straining to hear. The noise stopped. The woods outside were silent, completely still. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe a branch falling, maybe just my imagination. But even as I tried to go back to sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been out there. The next morning, I checked around the cabin. There was nothing, no tracks, no signs of anything. The forest was thick, the ground covered in fallen leaves. Anything could have passed through without leaving a trace. A few days later, I heard it again. This time I was awake. It was late, the fire had burned down low, and I was lying on my cot staring at the ceiling. Then, out of nowhere, I heard the same slow footsteps outside. I held my breath, listening. The sound moved around the cabin, slow and steady, not close to the door, but just outside, circling. I sat up, my heart pounding. I wanted to look, but at the same time I didn't. Some deep instinct told me that if I looked, if I made it known that I was aware, it would be worse. I stayed still, listening, waiting. After a while, the footsteps faded into the distance. The next morning, I found something. Near the back of the cabin, just beyond the tree line, a patch of earth had been disturbed. The leaves had been brushed aside. The dirt underneath scraped away like something, or someone, had been digging. It wasn't deep, just enough to make me uneasy. I told myself it was an animal. I had to believe that. Weeks passed. The noises continued. Some nights were quiet, others weren't. I never saw anything, never found any real proof that someone was out there. But I knew. I could feel it. One night, I woke up to something different. Breathing. Not mine. It was close, just outside the cabin wall. A deep, slow inhale. Then another. I froze. It was right there, inches away, separated only by the thin wooden planks of the cabin wall. I stayed as still as I could. My mind raced. I thought about grabbing my knife, about making a run for the car, but I couldn't move. I just lay there, listening to the slow, heavy breaths outside. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I found something new. Near the pump, a single footprint in the dirt. Barefoot. The print was wide, the toes pressed deep into the soil. Whoever it belonged to had been standing there for a while. I knew then that I couldn't stay. I packed my things. Took less than an hour. I didn't care where I went, only that I got out. As I drove away, I looked back once, just before the cabin disappeared behind the trees. There was nothing there, just the woods, silent and still. But I knew. Something had been watching me the whole time.